Hi, I'm here with Jeremy Cowan. He's a professor of sustainable food production systems in the Department of Horticulture at Kansas State University. And he happens to be taking the Distributism seminar that I'm teaching right now. So that's really cool. Jeremy is somebody that goes way back with me. We were in a book club together for a while. And so because of this combination of interest, I particularly wanted to have Jeremy on to talk about how he sees distributism. So welcome, Jeremy. Well, I wanted to ask you about, just your reaction to distributism. I didn't know how much you'd read about it before, if this was like your first real exposure to it, and then just like, what's your reaction now that we've had 3 different classes on it so far?
So I will say just straight up front that this has been my first real introduction with any kind of depth to distributism. I had heard the term before, probably in our book club meetings, and had looked really briefly at it. I've added Chesterton to my reading list, but just haven't gotten that far down it yet. And so I guess maybe to step back, I grew up in a fairly conservative family in a fairly conservative community. And so for me growing up, capitalism was, the answer to everything. The market's going to solve all of our problems because the market is not got a horse in the race or, whatever. It's, and as I've grown and learned and matured and maybe have opened my mind up to some of the other systems out there, being from that same background, you also have socialism bad, communism bad. This is, the antithesis of good and Christian values and all of those things. How can we possibly, be good Christians in that, in those types of societies and economies and whatnot? It's a very naive perspective on it. And I'm not going to say that I believe one way or another real firmly about socialism or communism, but I've come to see a lot more of the faults of capitalism and have opened my mind up to accepting that kind of feedback. I think for a long time I've been very aware of the corporatist nature of the capitalist system that we claim to live in. And I say it that way because most Americans, especially on the right, will say, no, we live in a capitalist system and it's the best thing ever. When the reality is that I don't think most of them understand what capitalism is if they're thinking that, the hegemony of corporations in almost every industry is capitalistic. It's not. And so, but then I've also, I read this book on the Nordic way of life and how it extolled social democracy or democratic socialism, and things like that. And it really kind of opened my eyes to the idea that these things can be put in place without being as onerous and destructive as my more right-leaning upbringing would have led me to believe. I've actually posted on Facebook recently about, I might actually be able to swallow universal basic income or single payer healthcare, things like that. And I guess all of that is background to say that as Americans anyways, we grow up with this idea that there's only one way or the other, right? It's either you support capitalism or you're a socialist or a communist or whatever, and there's no middle ground. And so when I was introduced to distributism, mostly through our relationship, it sounded like something that was a reasonable alternative to those dominant paradigms, with the only caveat being, I'm just not sure how we get there, right? Especially given the naivety of our general electorate and the unwillingness to even open ears and minds to new ideas, right? So to me, I see a lot of overlap between the distributist ideas that we've talked about so far and the agrarian principles that I think are really important. A closeness to the land, and that through that closeness and connection to the land and community, that societies would be better able to flourish, not because they're going to dominate economically on the world stage, but because they actually function in a way that allow people to thrive without having to worry about, how many zeros they're adding to GDP.
Hmm. Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, like there's this binary, what I don't know, I feel like I'm in an endless ping pong match, in the United
Right.
States, like for quite a long time now. And you're right, there's no middle ground. And so there's no way of thinking. And so people don't have the imagination, I guess, right,
Right.
to see beyond that. They're so focused on the other, well, and usually, capitalists hating communists.
Hmm.
It's weird that that's even still a thing to me.
Right. Well,
I have to say. But it definitely is in people's minds, and they're focused on that enemy. And so I think that's what sucks up all the energy and the imagination is, and that's why it's kind of so diabolical, is that it's just getting people to focus on this negative. Meanwhile, the rest of the world out there just passes them right by.
and then they
Um,
wonder what the heck is going on in America. Like, what's wrong with you guys?
Yeah, yeah. I know I get questions like, could you explain this, please? We need somebody to explain it. We've asked every American the same question.
I was in Scotland in 2015 when Trump was starting to become a serious contender for the Republican nomination, and everybody that I talked to was like, what is wrong with the US? Like, just scratching their heads. What is wrong with you guys?
It's hard to explain. But like I guess what I'm hearing from you is that learning more about distributism, and there sounds like there's been a lot of other stuff along the way too, but it has kind of like opened up your mind to that possibility of some other way. People right now, the term that is thrown around a lot is the third way, and that means different things to different
Right.
people. The central meaning is like it's neither one of these two, basically, as though there's only a third one. There's probably
Right.
a plethora of ones, but anyway, I mean, at least this kind of, it helps to open that door a little bit. But
Mhm.
I mean, if you want to, we could talk a little bit about feasibility. I mean, because I think this is a huge question, right? The
Right.
usefulness of it. Is it feasible in whole, in part, or not at all? And I thought that, your experience with not just organic or farming, but also um, your research, uh, your general political interests. I'm just interested in, like, can those two things come together? I don't know if I'm making any sense. In my
Right.
mind, it makes sense, but like, can your research interests, your knowledge about agrarianism and permaculture, right? Can that be brought to bear on that, either negatively or positively?
Right.
Yeah.
So I have a few thoughts on that. The first thing that occurs to me when you ask about feasibility is not in the United States, given our current social structure. And what I mean by that is that our social structures, the institutions that have traditionally defined sociality, is that a word?
I think so.
Among people in the West, things like family and community and religion and these things, those institutions are being systematically deconstructed at a national level. I think I think some of that is passive and it's just happening through apathy, and some of it's very active. Um, and what I mean by that is that we exist in these socially isolating echo chambers, right? We have our social media, the online platforms where people can go and throw jabs at each other and not feel bad about themselves because they're not looking you straight in the eye. Um, and then we've got the Facebook algorithms that feed us what we want so that we're more likely to look at the advertisements. And so I think that between that and our two-party system, the inevitability of polarization and clinging to our guns, so to speak, not the Second Amendment type, but holding on to our dogmas even tighter, is really what we're seeing across all of the different social issues. If you're right-leaning, you're being pushed more to the right by the echo chamber and resisting the same thing that's happening on the left. Those echo chambers pushing people farther to the left. It's basically making people dig in and become further entrenched in those ideologies, and probably farther to the extremes than they would be naturally inclined.
Yeah.
And so it becomes an us versus them, and it's becoming a worse us versus them, but on the right, left, the socialist, capitalist, the conservative, liberal spectrum. And I think it's making people dig in and really become more defensive of those dogmas, even if they don't really believe in them as much. And I think that why that becomes a detriment to opening up to a third way is because, oh, well, anything that's not capitalism is socialism or communism, and it's bad. So I don't care what you're calling it, it's obviously not capitalism, and so it must be bad.
Communism, yes.
Right. And so the same thing on the other side. I think maybe people who lean more left might be more open to something that only because it's not capitalism. And I think that, insofar as distributism is based on distributing those resources as broadly as possible in order for people to be able to self-sustain and then engage in their communities and things like that, I think it's probably more compatible with those on the left. That's just kind of a hunch right now. I haven't given it too much thought.
But there's there for everybody in a way. In other words, there's aspects of distributism that the left might recognize or be able to relate to. And there's also aspects that the right, especially when it emphasizes kind of fair competition. I mean, it depends on who's doing the extolling, but
right.
Returning to a smaller capitalism or something like that.
Just a more sane capitalism, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have really, politically, I've gone through these huge evolutions, right? When I first met you, I introduced myself as an anarchist, completely destroy the system. And I think I've backpedaled quite a ways from that, simply because it's not practical. I think at this point, I've come to a much more decentralist view of a Republican or a more purely democratic type system as being ideal. And the reason that I mention that is I think that if we were to try to implement something along the distributist lines, that it would have to be tried on a smaller scale. The founding of this country with the Union of States, the states were supposed to be these laboratories of freedom or liberty. And, arguably in the mid 1800s, the states really lost a lot of the autonomy that they were supposed to have had, I think, by design. Slavery was a huge issue that undermined states' rights insofar as the states were using that autonomy to inflict slavery on, an entire races of people. And, even outside of that, there's been kind of this handing over of power. It's just been convenient for the states to say, yeah, no problem. You guys at the federal level, go ahead and take care of that, as long as you're giving us money to do what we need to do, either implementing those federal policies or whatever else. And so the states have kind of just handed off that power. And as a result, we don't really have a system in which, any one state could go run off on its own and say, you know, we're going to try this totally different economic system or this
Right.
totally different political system, because they've lost that autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, you know, if there's a mechanism to get that back. And the only, I guess, another reason that I say that it needs to happen on a more small scale is simply because there's so many different interests in the U.S., so many different ethnic backgrounds, cultures, right? I think I read one paper that said there are 11 distinct cultures in the U.S., bio-geo region
Yeah.
type cultures,
Mm-hmm.
and because of that, it's like if a whole coalition in, say, Montana decided that they wanted to try something new, they've got to get through 49 other states that are far more populous, have far more congressional representation, despite the, you know, maybe the disproportionate representation in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
That trying to do anything on a federal level becomes very trying to do anything as a state when you're up against those federal hurdles, I think becomes very difficult.
Right. Could
I
this
may be outside of my wheelhouse going into that.
I think no, I think you're right. Like, could this be done at an even smaller level and be significant and avoid that problem? Or do you see it just like being something that the state basically has to control? So like would maybe a neighborhood or a small town in a state do things this way and have any sort of impact, or yeah.
I think to do it in the current system, to do it on that small of a scale is going to require somebody with deep, deep pockets that's willing to just hand it over, right? Because if we look at the largest owner of land across the US geography, it's the federal government. And so when we talk about the idea of distributing land, that seems to be the first place to look, because that's who holds title to all of that land, right? I don't know what the percentages are, and it's much higher in the West than it is in the middle of the country and in the East. But because those land holdings are so concentrated in federal hands, I think that unless the federal government was willing to hand those off to states or communities or something like that, I don't know how that would happen without somebody giving up what they've got willingly and voluntarily. And there's people out there that do that. I think I just read today that Warren Buffett has forked over another $4.1 billion in philanthropy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, some of the Zuckerbergs and people like that, they do, but they do have a lot left over even after all that.
Right.
Which is, I mean, I'm glad that they do it. But
Right.
yeah.
But I don't know how else we can distribute at least
Mm.
real property without having somebody willing to just say, here, let me put this into the pot.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And therefore, there's still this need to look to because of what's all that you've described has happened, to look to the federal government.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even the states don't own that much land. And the land that they do own is, most of it, as far as I can think of, is tied up in preserving natural places or historical places. And they're not just, oh, here's a bunch of farmland that the state owns, let's go ahead and divvy that out, right? Because that federal government owns a lot of rangelands. So I think it'll be difficult.
So we basically established the criteria. Like, if we were going to do this, it would have to be, if it was actually going to be something that might spread, even without the assistant or like a whole state, we would have to have some free land. Basically, we'd have to get that from somewhere, and it'd have to be from the federal government. So that means the federal government would have to, in the United States anyway, would have to basically make a decision to start distributing some land.
And I think they'd have to resurrect that idea, because I mean, back in the 1800s, I don't remember when the Homestead Act ended, but for a while they were effectively distributing land for the taking. It wasn't completely democratic insofar as everyone was just said, told, here's your allotment, go, go settle it. It was, if you want it, go get it.
Mm-hmm.
And, that I think was probably the closest that we got to some sort of a distribution of land and those resources for the good of as many people as possible. And I think that that was maybe in furtherance. I mean, it was for making sure that the US could hold on to its claim of the entire continent from East Coast to West Coast. But I think that the derivative benefit of that was a distribution of property and a realization, from my perspective, of that Jeffersonian ideal of, a nation of smallholding farmers being the most democratically engaged and appropriate um, system.
Right. So like we've been talking about land, would that even at this point in time be able to serve the appropriate purpose? And I guess I'm asking a pretty big question that's just been in the back of my mind, ever since I started studying distributism. They do tend to focus on land because
Mhm.
back in their day, for the most part, it was still possible to imagine a lot of people being able to, practice subsistence farming and kind of survive and maybe even thrive that way. But now that everything's been kind of confiscated from large numbers of people and has been swept up into these massive land holdings, both corporate and government, it would putting them back on the land, those that wanted to do it, would that be possible? Could people do it? Would they really want to do it? Um, would where would how would these decisions be made? So I don't know. Have you thought about this? I
Yeah.
mean,
No, I have actually. So one of the things that in my perfect world, if I could reshape the world in any way, what typically goes through my mind is I wish that we could figure out how to get everybody to at least grow something that
mm,
they're going to consume, right? I don't care if it's just one tomato plant on your porch. Growing that one tomato plant will give you so much more perspective on what goes into your body, uh, and maybe even pique your curiosity as to where it comes from when you're not getting it off of your porch from that one tomato plant. And I think that I'm not the biggest fan of our public education system, K through 12, for many reasons, but one of them is that it's not designed to enable people to take care of themselves. Um, and what I mean by that is the reality is we're biological creatures. We are animals that have biological needs within ecological systems. And nothing in K through 12 education really hammers that point home, right?
well,
There's no, I
yeah,
mean, we're told that you can live for, 4 minutes without air and 4 days without water and, or two or whatever, 2 weeks without food and all of these things. But the reality is that it's not that simple, right? You can live for maybe longer with some food, but if it's not nutritious food, it's either not going to be a very good quality of life or it's going to be very short. Um, and people aren't taught what that means. Like, what do we need to actually fuel our body? Now we have these colorful plates that say we need to put so much in this red corner, fruits and vegetables, and so much on this yellow corner with grains and cereals. And
food pyramid. Mm,
but it's still not driving home the idea that you need to be connected to what you're eating, because if you're not, you don't have the ability to ensure your own survival.
yeah.
Um, and I think as Westerners, right, we've probably taken that for granted for a good long time.
Hmm.
And it's the reason that I'm saying that is because when you ask the question, can people actually do something with a distribution of land, and from a homestead slash agrarian slash sustainable agriculture side of things? My short answer is no. And it's just because we've lost that ability. I think as a country, as a general society, Um, I think most people would founder if they tried to do something like that without some sort of support.
Yeah.